Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
NASA and the Department of Energy are exploring nuclear power as a way to support long-term missions on the moon by 2030. Here to explain why what sounds like science fiction matters and how it works is CEO of Nano Nuclear Energy, James Walker. Mr. Walker, thank you for joining me.
Hi there, Terry. I'm happy to be on.
So I want to start with what sounds to me like science fiction. Last month, Secretary Duffy, who's the acting NASA administrator, released an announcement that said the United States wants to put a nuclear reactor on the moon by 2030. My first question is, why? Isn't the potential to blow up the moon a bad thing?
Well, I would say nuclear, really, if you're looking at sort of a long-term strategy for powering yourself while you're up there, it's sort of your only option. And I say that because imagine the amount of diesel you would have to ship up into space to be able to continuously power yourself. And obviously that would run down very quickly, and then you would need more diesel. And so you've got more space shuttles just carrying much more explosive fuel, because it is much more explosive fuel than nuclear fuel, to the moon on a continuous basis. But because of the energy density in nuclear and sort of uranium, you could have a deployed system that goes to the moon that operates for years or decades at a time before needing any sort of refueling. So it's your option on that. And if people are saying, well, what about options, say, like solar? Like, you're in space, and obviously you've got direct line of sight to the sun. But the issue with that is that the moon actually has a lengthy 2-week night cycle with extreme temperature swings. So solar power will be unreliable unless you had enormous storage batteries that was to overstock power for that 2-week night cycle. So effectively, if you are interested in long-term space colonization or lunar bases or Mars bases, nuclear becomes quite quickly your only option. And your other point about blowing up the moon, I always like to point out that a nuclear reactor can't explode. The fuel is not enriched to the sort of level that you would need it to be enriched to create an explosion. It's enriched way below that level. So if you ever see those Hollywood dramatizations of an exploding reactor, there's probably the hydrogen in a reactor that's exploding, but the fuel itself, the old reactors, it could only melt. But even in this new fuels that are being utilized in these advanced reactor systems, those fuels cannot melt either. So you effectively have an incredibly safe, clean system that continuously output power, and you're not going to blow up the moon either. So.
Okay, I think you've made me feel a tiny bit safer. But I want to explore a couple of things that you laid out there. The first was long-term colonization. One of the things that Secretary Duffy said was that we are really in a race with China and Russia, and that the United States needs to develop and deploy this capacity first. Help us understand the logic there.
So they're exactly correct. So like China and Russia have just signed a joint lunar nuclear project to establish bases and power systems up there by about mid-2030s. And their planned power systems will also involve nuclear power because, again, it's sort of the only power system that could really service a long-term colony or base up there. But because China and Russia are collaborating on that, and they're both leading in certain sectors, I would say China at the moment is building 2 nuclear reactors a year, and Russia still has the best space program. They are still able to launch space shuttles. So that's what the US is up against, is that collaborative effort by them. And they're shooting for the mid-2030s. Really, that's not a long time to get everything in place to be able to establish very complicated things, which we haven't done in a long time. So it's sort of the space race too. And look, from the last space race, we got some enormous leaps forward. So we might very quickly see some enormous leaps forward again beyond what we achieved in the sort of 60s and 70s. But that's what we're up against, is that collaborative effort. And that's why there's the sort of the attitude to be a bit aggressive about getting ourselves up there and our timelines.
Let's address that timeline. 2030 is just like one presidential election cycle that goes by in a flash. Is that timeline realistic?
So there's a lot to be done. I mean, I don't want to speak on the NASA's behalf. I would say on the reactor front, getting a reactor ready to be launched within that time frame is definitely doable. So on the energy front, we're okay. And the reactors that even our company is developing at the moment are more than suitable to go up to the moon and then power long-term bases up there. And there's even some advantages. You don't need as much shielding in space because it's a radioactive area anyway, and you can put it anywhere because it's essentially a desert without an atmosphere. So you've got some actual engineering advantages with the moon. On the NASA front, they probably got a lot of work they've got to do now to get ourselves like beyond low Earth orbit and back into sort of high Earth orbit and beyond to take us back there. It's good. It's going to be aggressive. Like they're going to have to be aggressive to put the funding back in place to build up the infrastructure necessary to get these rockets up there. And I'm sure that the US has the advantage that it's not just a state-led enterprise. It does have private companies that are already involved in very cutting edge space technology. So the ability for the US to catch up, say, where Russia can still launch shuttles into space with a greater capability than the US could very feasibly catch up to them very quickly just because of that private sector involvement already that has been developing that space technology.
I'm speaking with James Walker. He's CEO of Nano Nuclear Energy. Let's follow up on that point you just made about the private sector companies involved in this as well. I mean, this is kind of a dangerous, pretty high-tech space. What kind of oversight or regulation would you want to make sure we have in place to make sure that the private companies who are engaged in this have the right incentives and we have the right ability to assess responsibility if something did go wrong?
I mean, it's a very good question because, the programs that NASA was running in the late 60s and 70s to get men on the moon and win the space race, they were very much state-led. Essentially, it was a Cold War race. And obviously, the incentives of private companies are very different. I mean, they're the sort of profit-led operations. So obviously, if the government is willing to pay private organizations to get there, they will do it. But I think essentially the big incentive for them would be industry beyond state incentives. So, for instance, if you were to establish actually lunar bases or lunar colonies up there, then the prospect of actually mining the moon becomes, and you've got a power system there, becomes a much more interesting prospect for these companies. Like if you were to be able to mine something like helium-3, which is on the moon, that is billions and billions, maybe trillions of dollars of worth of materials that would be incredibly valuable here on Earth. Now, you've probably heard over the years things like space mining and asteroid mining, but those are still never economic, even if they were technically feasible. But if there's a long-term established colony, and there is a continued exchange of materials and shuttles and persons, then the economics could become much more workable. And so their strategy might be obviously work with the state to get these things established, but then establish an industry up there. And if you can do that and you can incentivize it, then you get a massive rate of expansion, because those earlier moon landings, the problem was that why go back there after it's done? There's no incentive. And so effectively it becomes a money spending exercise with no further benefit. But if there is a financial benefit to doing this, then people will launch more up there. You will be able to fund more space journeys. And it does take care of the incentive to keep expanding into space rather than get there and then pull back, which is what happened before.
So you're implying that the ability to deploy this nuclear reactor on the moon is a stepping stone to perhaps many other things like space mining, but also broader space exploration.
Much broader space exploration. Like there could even be an argument made for having launching shuttles from the moon as an alternative. So if you've established a way to power your colonies with nuclear power reactors, the amount of power that you would need to launch, say, like for instance, the moon landing when the shuttle landed on the moon and then had to take off again, the amount of power it actually needed to get back into the orbit of the moon was way less substantial. So for instance, you could have activities where you can look at how you would launch from the moon to get to further exploration. So your first port of call might be docking at the moon, rehabilitating, and then launching from there to go for much more deeper exploration. And then nuclear could actually even provide additional benefits from there. So very different technology, but a sort of a thermal propulsion device that is nuclear powered for much longer explorations into space. So you don't need nearly as much fuel, because if you're launching from Earth and you need a lot of jet fuel, when you look at that space shuttle that's launching, most of that entire infrastructure is a fuel cask. And then once that is obviously exhausted, it's just jettisoned off into space. You could have a much more efficient launch if you are doing it from somewhere like the moon rather than from Earth.
I've been speaking with James Walker. He's the CEO of Nano Nuclear Energy. Thank you for helping put some of my science fiction fears at rest.
No problem, Terry. Thank you very much for having me on.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. On Federal News Network.